I've played through Doom 3 countless times. As a speedrunner, I do that to improve my runs. Throughout the years, I've noticed a pattern of behavior within my speedrunning endeavors, and after the initial steps of getting into a new game and learning its speedrun route, it goes like this. I speedrun the game, I get a time I'm satisfied with. I get fed up with the game, and then I take a 3 to 4 month break from the game. Now, after one of those breaks from my Doom 3 runs, I got the itch to play Doom 3 again, as I always do. However, that time I felt like trying something different. That is how I got introduced to a mod called Doom 3 Phobos, and I want to thank Jarek the Gaming Dragon for planting a seed for me to play this mod all the way back in 2020. So, welcome to my Doom 3 Phobos review/analysis video. Doom 3 Phobos is a great mod developed by Team Future, and I gotta be honest and say I'm really glad I decided to play it. Phobos is definitely the best Doom 3 mod I've come across by far. By this point, 3 episodes of Phobos have been released with no set release date for the next one. For me, they took about 10 hours of gameplay to finish, which is a lot of time for a completely free mod. Phobos was very easy to install. I literally just downloaded it from ModDB and followed the instructions in the readme file and then used the batch file to run it. For the mod to work, I needed the original Doom 3 and the original Resurrection of Evil expansion, which means that this mod does not work with the BFG edition. The only problem for potential new players with this is that Resurrection of Evil has recently been removed from the Steam store, so if you want to get it, you're gonna have to improvise. But if you're one of the lucky ones and you own both Doom 3 and Resurrection of Evil already, I highly recommend you play this mod, because on top of it being a really great mod, so many people probably won't get the chance to. One more thing I want to mention is that this mod does not work alongside any other mods, so you can't run it with the Doom 3 mod or its FPS unlocker. Okay, let's talk about the mod now. Phobos starts off very slowly, and it contains a well-balanced combination of intermittent storytelling elements and pure Doom gameplay. If you're expecting this to be just another mod that you can quickly plow through, Doom 3 Phobos is definitely not that. This mod has its own entire campaign, which means a new story, new characters, voice actors.
I'm not a robot.
New levels, and a different kind of gameplay loop than the original Doom 3. Phobos got me invested in its gameplay like no other mod I've ever played. This might be an unpopular opinion, but I think Phobos even overshadows the original Doom 3 gameplay. Honestly, I don't know if I'll ever go back to Doom 3 again after this, because some of the changes that were made for Phobos make the gameplay loop so much better. Now, the first episode of this mod was released back in 2018, so unlike the original Doom 3, Phobos has been influenced by a few modern games. One of the first influences I noticed was that of Amnesia: The Dark Descent. In both Amnesia and Phobos, you're given very little information about the character you're playing as at the start, because you've lost your memory. As you play through the game, you slowly find out more about yourself, and things start to make more sense as you are presented with pieces of your memory in flashbacks. I really liked this approach in Amnesia back then, and I think it works well in Phobos too. Now, when I noticed this influence, and many other things that you will see later in this video, I was very curious to find out if I was actually correct on my assumptions. So, I gathered all my curiosity and I reached out to the developers of Phobos, Team Future, and I interviewed them over email.
The inspiration actually limits itself to Soma, as it's the only of their games we're really familiar with, but I'm guessing there are plenty of similarities between that and their other games, so it's only natural to get that impression.
To combine these story elements with Doom gameplay, Phobos is mostly split into the story parts with flashbacks and the gameplay parts representing the present tense. The story parts are mostly interactive cutscenes that contain a lot of dialogue between the characters that gives you perspective on the current situation. The creators of this mod actually got people to do voice acting, and honestly, the actors are quite good.
What is it?
Something Samuel sent me. I don't know what it is, but it seems valuable.
The story itself is pretty cool as well, and the funny thing is, every time I played through the mod, I figured out that I'd missed some details the last time. So on each additional playthrough, I had multiple eureka moments. What I'm saying is, the story is a lot more complex than it seems at first, and it's just rewarding to get invested in it.
With Soma, we were mainly inspired by its story, the way the story is presented, and the mood and atmosphere of the game. When we first got to know the game back in 2015 or so, it helped us settle on quite a number of things. One of the first things we decided on was to use a communication system similar to Soma. So that's why the main communication between Miles and the player occurs via these comm devices.
During the story parts, a lot of times you need to interact with certain objects to progress, which has a lot to do with the characters you're talking about. The absolute best level of this type is when you have to break into a character's house to find what he had stolen from you earlier. I had a lot of fun exploring this level and figuring out what to do next. What positively surprised me is that even within these story parts, there's a good amount of attention to detail. There are numerous examples of this throughout the game, but here are a few. While you're talking to your friend over the phone in this room, if you take a better look at the walls, you can see some cool things, like this part of the wall used to measure how tall kids grew over time, indicating that you and Lee grew up together, or this poster that serves as a reference to the fire blue texture from the original Doom games. Then there are these pamphlets in many of the story levels that kind of clue you in about the characters' backstories. Later in the game, you can also find Lee's diary, which mentions somebody making creepy clicking noises outside of the barn where she's staying. There are so many cool little things like this throughout the mod, and I don't want to spoil any more of them.
Are you naked in there?
Well, maybe you could come in here and find out.
Now, as a casual player, I honestly really like this balance of gameplay and story. But as someone who likes replaying games, I would really love to be able to skip these story parts somehow. Having to wait for all the cutscenes to finish without being able to skip them really deters me in doing repeat playthroughs or creating single segment speedruns.
We've actually discussed doing something like this after we're done with the game, maybe for the release itself or after the fact, going back and making different versions. We obviously want people to experience the mod as it was intended, but it could be good to provide some different options, like no story, only story, etc. However, it may be way more difficult to make than it sounds. Things are very intertwined.
I have created a segmented speedrun of this mod, and it's one of the best projects that I've worked on, especially since I was the one who routed the entire speedrun and performed it. It's definitely a special feeling when you do everything from scratch by yourself, and I prefer this much more than competing with 1,000 other players. I showed my speedrun to Team Future, and here's some of what they said about it.
The skip you perform at the beginning of the Floodgate level was something I actually discovered not too many months before we released episode 3. I found it one night and showed it to the guys via a series of screenshots in Discord. We debated at that point whether to do something about it. A single clip brush would eliminate the whole possibility of that skip. We realized it was extremely unlikely for anyone to discover that skip on their first playthrough, since the game doesn't make it immediately evident where the Floodgate switch is located. In the end, we quite literally made the decision based on a coin toss. I flipped a quarter and it stayed in.
And that is how a flip of a single coin probably saved me around 3 or 4 minutes in the speedrun. If you want to take a look at that speedrun, I will leave a link in the description. Now back to the story. I would also just like to mention my adoration for the way the cutscenes were made. The environments in them look really nice, and it's quite a refreshing tone to see something other than the monotone bases on Mars. But what I really love about this, and what really reminds me of both Amnesia and Penumbra games, is how no characters are shown, except in pictures. I'm almost certain that this was done because creating and animating characters is just too difficult, time-consuming, or expensive, but like in many other examples, creativity comes from limitations, and it is exactly the not showing of the characters that gives this mod such a mysterious vibe and interesting quality. I would compare it to reading a novel in some way. You never really get to see the characters that you read about, but from the story itself, you get to imagine them yourself, and your brain paints a picture and fills in the gaps much better than if you were to just straight up see these characters in the game. Look at this cutscene, for example. There's actually nobody on the other side of that fence. It's just audio coming from that particular direction, but that doesn't really matter. It still feels like a genuine conversation.
It's one of those things where limitations can push you to interesting places. It wasn't initially a stylistic choice, but since then, it's kinda turned into a stylistic direction. There are plenty of things we could do better if we had proper character models and animation, as that would make it much easier to convey certain emotions, rather than just with dialogue and musical cues. However, it does force you to get creative, and the scenes definitely also gain something from being devoid of people. There's a certain level of infused nostalgia you get when places are deserted, which would be hard to replicate with traditional animated sequences. We don't have plans for showing more characters, but the way the story has played out, we also have to come up with less iffy solutions as to why you can't see the other characters.
The only other thing I don't love about some of the cutscene levels are these drawn-out cinematic angles. To me, they feel too lengthy. I feel like the same effect of the shot can be accomplished with it being at least 4 times shorter. Look at this part at the end of the second episode, where the bomb that is set to explode in 3 seconds takes like a minute to go off. There's almost nothing else happening except for the camera slowly moving away for a long time. Only at the end of the shot does some dialogue start playing, and I feel like this could have been shortened by a lot and it would have still had the same effect. I guess they just wanted us to hear the music. Now that I mentioned music, Phobos really does have some nice tracks.
It really makes me happy when people commend the music, as we pour lots of time into finding the right music for scenes. It's always been a big part of what I enjoyed in movies and games. The right music does so much for a scene, and enables you to convey things more elegantly than just exposition. We initially wanted to make an original soundtrack for the game, but that just wasn't feasible. Once we've discovered freemusicarchive.org, we quickly moved towards the composite soundtrack that we ended up with. I can't recommend and praise sites like Free Music Archive or Freesound enough, and that of course extends to all the amazing artists who provide their work for free. I don't know what we would have done without them.
It also has some sound effects that are not part of the original Doom 3, like the sound of announcing a new chapter, or the sound of getting a new objective. These sounds are very intuitive, and after hearing them for the first few times, you just get used to them and you start to know what they mean in the future without really thinking about it. I also really like the space note that they use a couple of times throughout the mod. Okay, now it's time for the main course. After all, this is a Doom mod, so in spite of the story being pretty good, the gameplay is the element where Doom games have always shined. In my opinion, Team Future nailed the combination of action gameplay and exploration and puzzles. There are so many changes to the gameplay compared to the original Doom 3, and I like almost all of them. Many of the changes have been inspired by the original Doom games, so if you happen to dislike some of the slower aspects of Doom 3, you will probably like what comes next. The movement speed has been increased, and it feels good to be able to move really fast if you need to. On top of that, there is no stamina bar anymore, so you can just sprint for as long as you want. Even though I'm very much used to abusing the stamina bar to the point of never running out in the original game, the Quake dual player in me is really happy about these changes, since now I can just blast my way through levels if I want to, without thinking about releasing that shift key all the time. The gunplay is amazing, and nearly all of the guns have been edited to suit the mod better. Let's review the guns in order of appearance. The fists are more or less the same, as clunky as in the original, except this time your character is wearing gloves. Phobos was definitely not made with melee combat in mind. The pistol has been modified to shoot with an uncapped rate of fire. That means that it can shoot as fast as you can spam your inputs. However, its accuracy decreases a lot if you do it that way, so it's only feasible at very close range. And just like in the original Doom games, if you fire shots one by one without spraying, the pistol is actually accurate. The only thing I don't like about this gun is that it's positioned in the center of the screen, especially since no other weapon shares the same property, and because of that it makes it look even more unnatural. The grabber has slightly been changed from Resurrection of Evil, since now you can't really pick up ammo with it anymore. Its only intended use is to deflect enemy projectiles and to use the enemies themselves as projectiles. One of the best examples of this are trites. When they are picked up and thrown, they will do splash damage to nearby demons. However, for people like me who abuse everything in the game to create speedruns, it is still possible to perform crazy grabber boosts if you know how to do them. And now for the most important weapon in the whole mod, the shotgun. All you OG Doom game lovers, you are probably gonna love this. Firstly, the shotgun uses an entirely different model. Furthermore, the spread has been nerfed to the point where it's actually feasible to use it at mid-range, just like in the original Doom games. This works really well for the mod, and the gun also feels amazing to use. So, instead of the atrocious 22 degrees like in the base game, Phobos gives you a nice 5.75 degree spread, which feels like a sniper rifle after playing the original. On top of that, the fire rate has been increased from shooting every 1.3 seconds to every 1.1 second. The only nerf that the shotgun got is the base damage, having been reduced from 182 to 160, which is definitely fair since everything else was massively improved. To be honest, I'm surprised they didn't reduce its damage even more. The shotgun doesn't use the same sound effect as in Doom 3, and now it sounds really punchy. There's just something about blasting enemies with this shotgun that I really seem to enjoy, because it is by far the weapon I used and abused the most while I was playing this mod. The funny thing is, I'm so used to the original Doom 3 shotgun that now this shotgun felt kind of overpowered. I almost couldn't miss, and I just kept getting more and more kills with it.
I was never a big fan of the original Doom 3 shotgun, but it was probably the right choice for the game as it was. Had Doom 3 ended up with wider ranges, kinda like Phobos, I'm sure they would have had a different shotgun.
The machine gun sound has been changed to sound like the MG that the enemies use in the original game, which is really cool. There is also no recoil on it anymore, so it's your ideal tracking option, almost like the LG in Quake games. The only problem is, your screen still shakes when you take damage, so consistently tracking while taking damage is not very viable. There's also a small spread on it, but you can still get long-range kills without much trouble. The grenades seem to be exactly the same as in the original game, bouncy and lethal as always, especially if you can land headshots on slightly tankier enemies. The chain gun has been modified and its fire rate is ridiculously fast now. Its DPS has also been increased from 120 to 168. The first time I fired it, I instantly remembered this scene. The chainsaw seems to be the same as in the original game, only now it's probably less useful because of the other changes in the mod that I'll talk about soon. The double barrel shotgun also makes a return. Its spread has been reduced significantly too, although I'm too lazy to figure out how exactly the spread works now. Here's a direct comparison and you be the judge. Its damage in one shot is the same, but the fire rate has been increased. It was a disgustingly powerful weapon in Resurrection of Evil, and it still is in Phobos. It helps you with instantly killing some of the stronger demons, and I especially like the fact that you can kill pinkies with it in one shot. The plasma gun has been modified to behave more like in the original Doom games. It can now fire a lot faster. Instead of the original fire rate of 8 balls per second, in Phobos you can fire 13.3 balls per second. The gun's damage has also been increased from 16 to 20 damage per ball, so the plasma gun is a lot more powerful than in the original game. Altogether, its DPS has been increased from 128 to 266, which is a staggering 108% stronger. However, Phobos balances this out by giving you less plasma ammo, and the gun now actually has a bit of a spread. Regardless, take a look at how quickly I can kill an archvile with it. The rocket launcher seems to be the same as in the original game. I couldn't find its dev file among the other weapon files, so I can't really check for sure. Its absence is probably a sign that the game just uses the default rocket launcher dev file instead, which implies that nothing has been changed.
I think the one thing I would change about it is a more satisfying explosion of the rocket, better sound effect and higher resolution particles, but it's probably fine as is.
And lastly, the BFG is much deadlier than in the original game. It still deals damage in the exact same way, like in the original Doom 3, which means that it deals projectile damage, splash damage, and tendril damage. However, you can't charge it anymore, which at the same time means that you can't overcharge it. You can only fire one projectile now, but the projectile that it does fire deals 1600 direct hit damage and 800 splash damage, which is basically the Doom 3 BFG with the quad damage power-up. The ammo for it is pretty scarce, and you can only hold 9 cells at the time, which, if you do some simple math, is exactly the amount of damage potential you can hold as in the original game, only this time you have to use it in doses that are 4 times as potent.
I decided I wanted the BFG to be much more of a decisive weapon when you used it, and that it should be more akin to launching the nukes when you do. That's why I changed it to a single shot load, which is already at max charge.
Let's talk about the difficulty. Now, me being an old school FPS veteran of sorts, I just had to play on Nightmare because that's how I enjoy games like these. If you're a casual player, I wouldn't recommend playing Phobos on Nightmare. Why? Well, two reasons. Firstly, this mod is a lot harder than the original Doom 3, so playing on Hurt Me Plenty will be just enough of a challenge for you. Secondly, even though the combat in Phobos feels really good, it's not the only element that makes this mod great. This mod also shines because of its puzzles. There are a lot of levels that have a really cool puzzle that you need to solve to progress, whether it's rearranging the symbols and matching patterns, evenly distributing fuel through different size containers, or figuring out pipe systems and planning out your route properly. You're definitely gonna have to think and get involved in understanding how things work to progress.
As for puzzles in general, we've mostly been looking towards the Dark Forces series of games, most notably Dark Forces and Jedi Knight. Other influences come from BioForge or Half-Life. We haven't always been too successful with our puzzles, and it's a really difficult aspect to master. Some of our puzzles, especially in the second episode, were too disjointed from the environment. We have the good old gallons of water puzzle that you come across in the fuel system levels. It takes place on a monitor, and you can't really see the effects on the environment, so you don't get that immediate feedback. This is something we're trying to improve on for later episodes. The environmental puzzle in the floodgate level may be hard, but you can see what you're doing through the windows, and there are maps thrown around the place with indicators on the possible paths.
For the people who don't like puzzles in games, let me assure you, it's nothing super complicated. It's enough to keep you engaged, but not too much where you'd be losing your shit trying to figure it out. This is another thing that makes Phobos even more similar to the Amnesia and Penumbra games. I must say, the way that Team Future made these puzzles and incorporated them into the levels like this, really well done. Now, because there are many puzzles everywhere, some of the level layouts might seem a bit confusing at first, but in my opinion, this actually suits the mod perfectly. For some levels, you are required to figure out the layout of the level to the point where you can successfully solve the puzzles, and after that, you will easily know where to go. Whereas if there had been no puzzles to solve, the levels would have seemed a lot more complex, if you know what I mean. What I also love is that there are a bunch of well-hidden secret areas all around, some of them with that sweet ammo for the more powerful guns that you kinda saved for special occasions, making the secrets feel rewarding for being found and also encouraging exploration. What I also love about Phobos is that there are only a handful of invisible walls in the mod, so if I wanted to try and jump from a random location to my death or try to find a potential skip, I can actually do that. I don't know why, but I just really dislike when they put up a lot of invisible walls in games. You see something interesting and you want to try and jump over there somehow, only to hit your head against an invisible wall. This is something that I hate about the Lost Mission campaign in the BFG edition. So many stupid invisible walls. There are also many little details within the maps that either surprised me or made me laugh, like the presence of these arcade machines that are actually playable and are a lot better than the original Super Turbo Turkey Puncher. But also little things like this.
I made the neon Cosmic Flapjacks restaurant sign for the little diner at the end of episode 1. That's probably the most memorable of those little in-world details that I could take credit for. I also made the Bored magazine cover, which is obviously just a wired gag, and the Hellified energy drink with the little Doom cover imp holding the drink can, which I still like all these years later. Also, I may or may not have created the additional Booty magazine covers. It's always fun to create little world details like these, the sorts of things where you're just taking a few hours out of an evening to make a small art asset that just adds a little more to the game world. Well, I guess it's mostly nods and zeitgeist. The blog thing was inspired by the time where everybody and their brother had to have a blog and write inconsequential nonsense. Then we have the president is a duck thing, which actually isn't about Donald Trump, which we've seen people state. It's a South Park reference to the You're Getting Old episode.
The levels where you fight demons are set in the bases on Mars, but they have a distinctly different vibe from the original game's levels. They're more colorful and less claustrophobic, making it much easier to believe that people actually live there. However, there are also some of those classic areas that feel like the original Doom 3, which, if you're still watching this video at this point, you probably have a lot of love for. When I think back on playing Phobos, there are just so many more open areas in this mod, and they all look beautiful. The only ones that show the lesser graphical capabilities of Doom 3 are the ones that depict the outside world in the cutscene levels, but they still have a certain charm to them. Now, to continue talking about the difficulty, let's talk about the enemies. The roster contains almost all of the normal Doom 3 and Resurrection of Evil enemies, but they also resurrected a few enemies from the older Doom titles, like the Pain Elementals, the Arachnotrons, and the Barons of Hell. On top of that, there's one new enemy as well, called the Bereft Soul, which is a kamikaze lost soul that can cripple you or even kill you in one hit if it explodes in your face, and depending on the difficulty that you're playing on. I really like this new enemy, because from playing Resurrection of Evil, you get used to dealing with normal lost souls with the grabber, and then when you try the same strategy for the Bereft Soul, it can explode in your face. So later in the mod, when they spawn both of those enemies together, you want to use the grabber to deal with them, but you can't. And at the same time, there are too many of them to shoot individually with a machine gun, and you want to deal with them as fast as possible before they come close to you. It's a nice way to increase tension and actually make the flying monsters dangerous, since in the original game, they weren't really much of a threat. They also included this explode in your face mechanic with trites. If you pick them up and bring them closer with a grabber, or if you're close to them when they die, they will deal some damage to you. However, the other small spider enemies called ticks don't do that. The classic enemies of Doom 3 have been significantly buffed in Phobos. The machine gunners are very deadly, and even on Hurt Me Plenty difficulty, they can kill you in 2 seconds of rapid fire if you come close. On the other hand, for the pistol guards and shotgunners, I have not really noticed much of a difference. They kind of feel the same. Phobos also added an additional Z-Sec enemy, and you only encounter them in the last levels of episode 3, the Plasma Gunners. These guys are slightly healthier than their Z-Sec friends, and their headshot multipliers are below 1, which makes them take less damage when shot in the head. This makes sense because they are equipped with these heavy helmets. They do a decent amount of damage, but the best part about them is that their plasma cells have huge knockback, which can throw you around and make you miss everything. The imps have been buffed significantly, and you can really feel it when you're fighting them. They can easily overwhelm you now, because their attacks are a lot more frequent, they move faster, and they even have this new attack that they can do, which is throwing 2 fireballs at you in quick succession. This caught me off guard many times. The Vulgars initially seem to be the same as in Resurrection of Evil, but they are a lot more prone to lunging at you. When they lunge at you and hit you, they can instantly do 2 more attacks, and this can cripple you, even on Hurt Me Plenty, which is also a great lesson not to spend too much time close to them. The maggots feel more or less the same. I can't really say I noticed much of a difference, they just have a faster running speed. These enemies I just mentioned have a unique property in Phobos, which is that some of their spawns are randomized. This means that sometimes, when you're playing certain levels, you can get attacked by a shotgunner, but other times, the game will spawn an imp instead. Sometimes, you will also get a Vulgar instead of an imp. I think that this is a pretty nice way to slightly diversify fights and make every playthrough a bit more unique.
It's really because I wanted our maps to have an added element of unpredictability. There's many game spaces that work well with multiple types of enemies and enemy setups, and I wanted to take advantage of that and give some added spice on repeat playthroughs. The gameplay gets an additional element of chaos when it can keep you guessing on subsequent playthroughs.
The wraiths are really fast now, and they sprint as fast as you do, so you can't really escape them. When they teleport, they also teleport a bit further in front of where the teleporting animation happens, so you can't just crouch down and anticipate their position as they teleport in. And even if you could, they would attack you while they're only half teleported in, and because of this, they're a nuisance to deal with. Personally, I really like this, but I can see how someone would call bullshit on this, since it's kind of deceiving. The commandos feel more or less the same, they're probably just slightly faster as well. The chain gunners are also deadly, even more so than in the original game, since the chain gun has been buffed a lot. In the same way that the machine gunners can kill you quickly if you get close, chain gunners' damage also seems to drop off with distance. However, they're not as hard to deal with since the shotgun spread is a lot smaller. If you aim for the head and shoot before they start hitting you, you can quite frequently take them out in one shotgun shot. Speaking of headshots, I noticed some interesting damage scaling numbers in Phobos for certain enemies. Most enemies in the mod have a headshot damage multiplier, which means when you hit them in the head, the damage you did gets multiplied by their headshot multiplier. In the original Doom 3, the headshot multiplier is mostly 2, meaning that shooting most enemies in the head results in dealing twice the damage. However, in Phobos, some enemies like the Imp have a headshot multiplier of 4. Then you have the Commandos, including the Tentacle Commando and the Chain Gunner, with a multiplier of 6. And finally, the Sawyer Zombie has the most extreme example, with his headshot multiplier being 8, which is insane. Now, this makes it so that you can use the pistol for taking these enemies out effectively, and because of their large headshot damage multipliers, each of the mentioned enemies can be killed with 3 pistol headshots. That's quite an interesting choice, Team Future.
In all honesty, I'm not sure I recall implementing those specific multipliers. Weirdly enough, except for tweaking it when dealing with helmeted enemies like C-Sex, headshot multipliers were never something I looked closely at, so that was likely implemented a long time back and just ended up flying under my radar.
The Kaku demons have been slightly reworked to shoot purple fireballs. They look pretty cool, but just like in the original game, they aren't much of a threat. Phobos does a good job of spawning them at the most inconvenient moments, which slightly increases their deadliness. The pinkies are faster, and if they get a hit on you, they can stun lock you very easily and just take you down. They could do that in the original game too, but now their attack frequency is buffed as well. So if you have 2 pinkies attacking you and 1 stun locks you, you're pretty much dead. Luckily, the double barrel shotgun kills them in 1 shot, if you can spot them. That's right, there are also Spectre pinkies. Oh man, to me they weren't much of a threat because I know exactly how they sound, so as soon as I heard this, I know that one is very close by, but I can definitely see this scaring the shit out of someone on their playthrough, since pinkies don't really make any sound when they move. The Revenants are really strong as well. Their missiles are even more mobile, which means they can make tighter turns, and I think they travel slightly faster as well. It's definitely harder to dodge them now compared to the original game, which makes the Revenants a bigger threat. When they spot you, they make a sound very similar to the sound in the original games. And they also make a cool bone sound when you jib them. Hell Knights, Mancubi and Bruisers are more or less the same, except for being faster of course. Plus, they seem to do even more damage than in the original game. The Archviles by themselves are also not much different, but the way that Phobos uses them in some of the levels is a lot different to the original game, and they play a huge part in deceiving the player. If you play the mod, you will see what I'm talking about. Honestly, I really like what Team Future has done with the Archviles. Well done. The only enemies that were left out so far are the Cherubs, but honestly, nobody misses those, as they are pretty annoying to deal with, and not in a good way like the Bereft Soul. Plus, with the guns being as strong as they are now, I think they would be much less of a threat anyways.
The decision to not include Cherubs was made years ago, when the majority of the team voiced their unanimous dislike of the enemy design.
The Arachnotron is a huge bastard, and his projectiles are pretty strong, with huge knockback as well. It's almost like a mini boss enemy. It's definitely not hard to hit it, but just make sure to dodge those projectiles, or else only 2 or 3 can already shave off most of your stack. They also have a melee attack that you don't want to be in the vicinity of.
Visually, the Arachnotron was recreated using some old concept art for Doom 3. As for the scale of the creature, I'm not sure whether that was taken from concept art as well or not, but the sheer size of the thing means there's quite a limited number of scenarios where you can really use it, so I think we naturally wanted to make it more of a tanky, threatening creature for the moments when it does appear. Thinking about it more, I do wonder if we could have included it in the game more if it was half of the current size and less tanky, more along the lines of the classic version. In that case though, it would have been closer to the dimensions of the Pinky, whose size also makes it somewhat limited in the viable spaces you can place it in game. So I think it likely still would have ended up being one of the rarer monsters, and of course less threatening than it is now. I think we probably got the best of all aspects with how the Arachnotron currently is.
And last but not the least, the Barons of Hell. These guys are not that fast, but they don't need to be, since their projectiles deal immense damage. On top of that, their projectile splash radius is insanely huge as well.
We followed the Doom 3 scene way back when it was first announced. I fondly recall perusing every frame on those initial videos and screenshots. One of my favorite monsters from those days was the Baron of Hell, often referred to as Birdman. We always wanted to include that, but it's not an aspect we have a lot of resources in, so when Kenneth Scott recreated the original model, it was a no-brainer to include it.
There was a fight in episode 3 that I kept dying on, and I just couldn't dodge the fireballs once they were thrown at me. It seemed like wherever I went, the splash damage was so insane that I took critical damage. To be fair, I was playing on Nightmare difficulty, but still, keep your distance and keep moving or else you're gonna be toast pretty quickly. Definitely a challenging enemy to fight, but also pretty dependent on the area where you fight it. If you had a lot of open space, however, they would almost be too easy to beat, even if you were fighting a few of them. I cannot even express how much love I have for this mod. When I played it the first time, I found it entertaining enough for one playthrough. But then, after some time, when I decided to play it again when episode 3 came out, I replayed the whole thing and the experience was even better than I remembered. I started to figure out the story even more and it got me more invested in it. I also started exploring the levels in more detail and I came across some very interesting findings. Now, before I continue, I will now be talking about some secrets and Easter eggs, so this is a major spoiler warning. If you plan on giving this mod a try, go to this timecode to skip the part where I spoil everything for you. Some of these secrets would have an infinitely better effect on you if you found them yourself. Okay, now that you've been warned, let's get into it. Phobos has a surprising amount of secrets, references, and Easter eggs. One of my findings is this hidden room in the last level of episode 1, which is a cool Wolfenstein reference. This is a very simple Easter egg that you will probably come across if you explore the levels to find more ammo. If you just crawl inside this vent and reach a dead end, you can move a soda can that reveals a hidden small computer panel that you can click on to open the hatch to this secret. This is a neat little Easter egg, but this is not the only Wolfenstein reference in Phobos. In the prologue, just after you get out of your room and go down the stairs, there's another Wolfenstein reference on the list of people who occupy the rooms within your block. If you take a better look at the list of occupants, depending on what you've played in the past, you might recognize some of these names. There's also a small Doom 3 reference when you're in front of the doctor's office in the prologue. You can see Campbell and Swan in the briefing room and then your character says this:
Please do not feed the monkeys.
Those were the more simple Easter eggs and references I found, but now let's take a look at the more elaborate ones. In the prologue, if you decide to explore the map a bit, you might come across a Sharpie that you can pick up on this box. Now, if you're paying attention, you might have noticed that each room has a small whiteboard out front, with something written on it or drawn by the occupants themselves. For one of those drawings, if you pick up that Sharpie and backtrack all the way to the beginning, you'll be able to write something on that whiteboard. Then, when you do that, this happens. This is a neat little reference to the game Life is Strange. Personally, I have not played this game, but I remember watching some playthroughs back when it came out. The studio that created this game was mentioned in the mod's credits, so I assume that some of the story elements of Life is Strange influenced Phobos as well.
The reason we went episodic was mostly because of Life is Strange. Way back in the day, we did have 3 episodes, but they were all part of one big release, like Doom. Later on, we decided to just do 1 episode, but that changed with Life is Strange. We instantly fell for the way the story was presented, with the ends and beginnings of the episodes. Life is Strange was definitely provided some inspiration for our characters, and what we went for with the voice actors. A funny story about that. To begin with, we didn't have Lee as a character. The voice actor, Carly, was auditioning for Miles. We picked Abigail for that part because she was just a shoe-in for her, but Carly was so impressive that we just had to include her, and that's how Lee came about. The inspiration for the character mainly came from Rachel Amber from Life is Strange, so in the first few days of writing, we kept calling her Rachel rather than Lee. Eventually, Lee took on a life of her own though, and is very different from the initial inspiration.
But now, after all of these references, here comes the biggest one out of all of them. This one surprised me the most and sent me down a bit of a rabbit hole. In the chapter called The Beginning of the End, there is a room when you go down a set of stairs that is normally closed due to a lockdown. But after deactivating the lockdown and opening everything in the level, you can go back and find that the door is now unlocked. When you enter the room, a distinct sound that the computer makes can be heard. Next to the computer, there's a panel on the wall with a keypad, and it doesn't seem to serve the purpose of opening a locker with ammo, which is what keypads are normally used for in Doom 3. On the lid of the panel, there's a post-it note of a drawing of an airplane. Now, at first I didn't even notice this, but after my 3rd playthrough and when I was watching my cousin play, I told her to save the game there because I only noticed the panel then and it started to intrigue me. I was gonna investigate this after she was finished with her playthrough for the day. While she was still playing, we talked about what this could be, and we both agreed that the airplane drawing is probably a hint for the panel code. There was most likely a flight number that we needed to find and then use it to unlock whatever this is. However, we did not really have anything else to go on, so we just continued playing. After she had finished playing, I booted up the game, and since I had nothing to go on except random flight numbers, I was gonna try my luck in cracking the code by brute forcing it, which means inputting every possible combination of 3 numbers numbers until I happened to unlock it. Knowing how Doom 3 codes work, I worked with the assumption that the numbers don't repeat, so I started from 123, then 124, 125, 126, 127, 128, 129, and so on until I went all the way to 815. That was it. It must have been some flight 815. So what now? Nothing's opening. Then I thought that it must have opened some other door on the map. So I tried to get out of the room, and then this happens. It was some sort of drawing only visible in UV light. So naturally, because it's displayed for such a short time, I took a screenshot to be able to take a proper look at it. It definitely looked very cool and it was set up beautifully, but what was the purpose of this? Whatever it was, I was determined to find out. So naturally, when I searched for Flight 815, one of the top results was Oceanic Flight 815. This was the flight from the 2004 series called Lost. So, by continuing to dig around Lost, I found the mention of the Swan, which is one of the words written on the map. And from there, I clicked on a few links and voila! I actually found this exact map, only before it was recolored for the mod. So, having found this map, I assumed that it must have appeared in the series itself, and lo and behold, I was right. This is a scene from Season 2, Episode 17 of Lost. The map that is revealed is called the Blast Door map. So, they basically recreated this scene and put it in the game.
We were doing a lockdown thing in that level, and we just had to do the hatch lockdown from that show. Lost gets a bad rap because of how the show ended, but it was a massive event while it was running. We're huge fans of the show, not because of how things were solved, but how they were laid out and grew. I guess we have a natural desire to pay homage to the things we like, and recreating some of the things from Lost as Easter eggs was so much fun.
Easter eggs aside, there are also some creative moments in Phobos, which honestly surprised me. There's a cool gimmick with archviles spawning into one of the levels just to mess with you a bit and to possibly waste your ammo. It's also a bit of foreshadowing for the next part, where you will be sort of haunted by archvile appearances. This is the only level in the game where I genuinely got lost, and I could not for the life of me figure out where I was or where I needed to go. All the hallways looked the same to me, and I was constantly confused. However, eventually I just kinda stumbled upon where I needed to go. Regardless of me being lost, the haunting archviles were a really nice touch for this level, and I should have honestly realized that whenever the archviles came back and started spawning in enemies, that was a cue that I was on the right path to progress in the level. There's a section in one of the levels where after you call an elevator, the lights go out and you have to fight a horde of crawler imps. They are not nearly as easy to hit as normal imps, which makes this a pretty tough fight. I definitely died there a couple of times. Really cool fight though. The last fight in episode 3 is pretty awesome as well, although I'm not gonna spoil how that one works, but the idea behind it is pretty cool. The first time I played it, it seemed like it would never end, but after a few more playthroughs, I realized it's not as long as I first thought. I also noticed that in some of the cutscene levels, when you're supposed to find an item, it is also randomized to spawn between a couple of predetermined locations. There are so many interesting things about this mod, and I could probably go on talking about it for hours, but that's not the point of this video. I want to also leave something for you, the player, to discover yourself.
I originally joined the mod in May of 2010 because I love Doom 3 and wanted to create Doom 3 levels. I never would have imagined it expanding to the size and scope it currently is. It's been a journey unlike anything else in my life and probably unlike most things that'll come after it. The picture in my head of what the game will look like in the finished state and what I pictured it looking like in the early days are very different things. And my sensibilities and preferences as a designer and gamer have changed since then. The truth is, we had a complete level set of roughly 10 or so maps as far back as 2012 or so. We could have released that back then and called it a day, moved on to other projects and kept learning and working with other things. I think the project would likely have been received pretty well back in the early 2010s, even in the state it was in, but it was nowhere near the level of quality and scope it is now. And if we'd released it back then, I think I'd look back on it now and think of it as being pretty amateur stuff. There's always a strong argument to be made that as a creator, you should just work on stuff and complete it in a reasonable span of time so you can focus on new things. One could argue that releasing the mod and moving on done over a decade ago would have been the far more pragmatic move, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree with them. But there's also the solid truth that if we hadn't significantly amped up our quality expectations and set the bar higher and decided to make something even bigger and better, it would have never grown us as designers and creators the way it's ended up doing. We've gone far beyond the limits of what I would have seen us as capable of accomplishing back in the early days. Sometimes in life, you have to keep pushing forward, even though you're not entirely clear what the end result will look like, through the sheer belief and determination that something better and worthwhile will result from it on the other side. And I think this project very much shows that. It's funny to think about it. This project's been a daily part of my life for over 15 years. It's been with me through some pretty dark times and low points, and in some ways served as a lifeline, something for me to focus on and pour all my blood into when I wasn't feeling great or was grappling with real life struggles. We had many conflicts as a team in the earlier years, when we were younger and less mature, that would have ended many other projects, but none of us walked away. Instead, we all committed to keep pushing and grinding, even when the end goal wasn't clear, and I'm glad we all did that. The fact that this project still exists, in spite of the obstacles and setbacks it's encountered, is, all things considered, somewhat of a miracle. And as much as players might enjoy it, I can promise it's been just as fulfilling and intrinsically rewarding for me to work on it. Thank you to everyone who played.
Seriously, if you've never played this mod and you have both Doom 3 and Resurrection of Evil, go download it and play it. Give the mod some time as well, because it starts off very slowly and only gets better as you go on. And to the people who have created this mod, Team Future, thank you very much for your effort. I really enjoyed what you have created, and please don't patch out any of the things that I abuse in the speedrun. Just kidding. To anyone who stuck around to the end of the video, thank you once again for watching, and I hope you will give this hidden gem a chance. All the relevant links are in the description, and I'll see you in another video at some point. Bye.